I stared at the certified letter in my hands, my fingers trembling as I read the number again. $250,000. $250,000 in fines for digging a well on my own property. The HOA president stood on my porch with a smug smile, watching me absorb the devastating blow that would destroy everything I had worked for. "You should have listened when we told you to stop," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Now you will learn what happens when you defy the Meadowbrook HOA." I looked past her at my ranch, the 40 acres I had dreamed of owning my entire life. The well that would give me the water I needed to make this place thrive. The same well that had just become the most expensive hole I would ever dig. But as I stood there, feeling the weight of financial ruin crushing down on me, I had no idea that this woman had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because what she did not know was that my property sat on water rights that dated back over a century. Rights that gave me control over every drop of water that flowed to her precious subdivision. That is when I realized I was not just going to survive this attack. I was going to turn it into the most profitable revenge in HOA history. I had dreamed of owning a ranch since I was 12 years old. Growing up in the cramped suburbs of Phoenix, I would spend hours staring out my bedroom window, imagining wide open spaces where I could breathe freely without hearing my neighbors argue through paper-thin walls. I wanted land that was truly mine, where I could grow my own food, raise my own animals, and live by my own rules. After 25 years of saving every penny, working overtime shifts at the engineering firm, and living in a studio apartment that cost more than most people's mortgages, I finally had enough money to make my dream come true. I spent months searching for the perfect property, driving hundreds of miles through rural counties, looking for that special piece of land that would become my sanctuary. When I first saw the 40-acre ranch outside of Meadowbrook, I knew I had found my home. Rolling hills covered in native grass stretched toward the horizon, broken only by clusters of ancient oak trees that had stood there for generations. A small creek ran along the eastern border, and the soil was rich and dark, perfect for the organic farming operation I had planned for years. The real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Margaret, walked me through the property with obvious enthusiasm. "This is perfect for someone who wants to get away from it all," she said, gesturing toward the peaceful landscape. "No traffic, no noise, just pure country living. You will love the privacy out here." I signed the papers that same afternoon, my hands shaking with excitement as I wrote the largest check of my life. The ranch cost me nearly every dollar I had saved, but I did not care. I finally had my piece of the American dream, 40 acres where I could build the life I had always wanted. The first few weeks were magical. I woke up every morning to the sound of birds singing instead of car alarms. I spent my days walking the property, planning where I would plant crops, where I would build a barn, where I would dig a pond for the livestock I hoped to raise. The sunset from my front porch was better than any painting I had ever seen. My nearest neighbors were about a mile away, living in what looked like a small subdivision of modern homes. They seemed friendly enough when I met them at the local hardware store, welcoming me to the area and offering advice about the best places to buy feed and supplies. "You picked a great spot," one of them told me. "We all love living out here. The community really looks out for each other." I took that as a good sign. After years of living in anonymous apartment complexes, the idea of being part of a real community appealed to me. I imagined helping neighbors with their projects, sharing vegetables from my garden, maybe even hosting barbecues for the whole area. But then I started receiving the letters. The first one arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by regular mail in a crisp white envelope with Meadowbrook Homeowners Association printed in the return address. I stared at it in confusion, wondering if it had been delivered to the wrong address. I lived on a ranch, not in a subdivision. There had to be some mistake. I opened the letter anyway, expecting to find a welcome packet or an invitation to some community event. Instead, I found a formal notice informing me that my property fell under the jurisdiction of the Meadowbrook HOA, and that I would be required to comply with all community covenants and restrictions. "This cannot be right," I muttered, reading the letter again. The real estate agent had never mentioned anything about an HOA. The property was marketed as rural ranch land, not as part of some suburban development. I had specifically chosen this location to escape exactly this kind of bureaucratic nonsense. I called Margaret immediately, expecting her to clear up the confusion, but her response made my stomach drop. "Oh yes, I forgot to mention that," she said casually. "The HOA was formed about 5 years ago when the subdivision was built. It covers the whole area now, including your ranch. But do not worry, they are pretty reasonable. Just keep your property looking nice and you will be fine." That night, I sat on my porch and read through the HOA covenants for the first time. Page after page of rules and restrictions that seemed designed for suburban lawns, not working ranches. No structures without approval. No commercial activities without permits. No alterations to the natural landscape without written consent. And buried deep in the fine print, one rule that would change everything. No private wells without HOA approval and compliance review. The water problem became obvious within the first month. The municipal supply line that served my property had been designed for a single-family home, not a working ranch. The water pressure was barely enough to fill a bathtub, let alone irrigate crops or provide for livestock. When I called the water department, they explained that upgrading the service would cost over $30,000 and take 6 months to complete. "Most folks out your way just drill their own wells," the technician told me over the phone. "With your acreage, you should have no problem finding good water, probably save you money in the long run, too." That made perfect sense to me. I had always planned to be as self-sufficient as possible, and having my own water supply was an essential part of that vision. I started researching well-drilling contractors and water rights laws, determined to do everything by the book. The process was more complicated than I expected, but I was thorough. I filed applications with the county planning department, obtained permits from the State Water Commission, and hired a certified hydrologist to conduct soil tests and determine the best location for the well. Every step cost money I could barely afford, but I wanted to make sure everything was completely legal and properly documented. The hydrologist's report was encouraging. My property sat above a substantial aquifer that could easily support a high-capacity well. The recommended drilling site was about 200 yards from my house, in a location that would provide excellent water pressure and minimal environmental impact. I was feeling confident about the project when the second HOA letter arrived. This one was different from the first. Instead of the polite, form-letter tone of the welcome packet, this message was sharp and threatening. "It has come to our attention that you are planning to drill a well on your property without obtaining proper approval from the Meadowbrook HOA," the letter read. "This activity is strictly prohibited under Section 12.3 of the Community Covenants. You are hereby ordered to cease all well drilling activities immediately and submit an application for approval through the proper channels." I read the letter 3 times, my anger growing with each word. I had followed every legal requirement, obtained every permit, and done everything exactly as the law required. Now some HOA board was telling me I could not access water on my own property. I decided to handle this reasonably. I called the number listed in the letter and asked to speak with someone about the well situation. The woman who answered the phone was polite but firm. "I can schedule you for the next board meeting," she said. "That would be next Thursday at 7 p.m. You will have 5 minutes to present your case." 5 minutes to explain why I needed water on my ranch. The absurdity of it made my blood boil, but I agreed to attend the meeting. I spent the rest of the week preparing a presentation that explained my water needs, showed all the permits I had obtained, and demonstrated that the well would have no negative impact on the surrounding area. The HOA meeting was held in the community center of the subdivision, a sterile room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs arranged in rows. About 20 people attended, most of them middle-aged residents who looked like they had never set foot on a working ranch. The board president, a woman named Linda Harrison, called the meeting to order with the efficiency of someone who enjoyed wielding authority. She was in her 50s, with perfectly styled gray hair and a pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "We have one item of new business tonight," she announced. "Mr. Johnson's request to drill a well on his property. Mr. Johnson, you have 5 minutes." I stood up and began my presentation, explaining the water shortage problem and showing the permits I had obtained. I tried to keep my tone respectful and reasonable, focusing on the practical necessity of having adequate water for ranch operations. But I could see from their expressions that they had already made up their minds. Linda Harrison listened with the bored patience of someone going through the motions, while the other board members whispered among themselves and checked their phones. When I finished, Linda barely looked up from her notes. "Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Johnson. The board will take your request under advisement and provide you with our decision within 30 days. 30 days? I asked, unable to hide my frustration. "I have crops to water and livestock to plan for. The well contractor is already scheduled to start work next week." "Then I suggest you postpone that work," Linda replied coolly. "Any well drilling activity that begins before you receive written approval from this board will be considered a violation of the community covenants, subject to fines and legal action." I left that meeting knowing that reasonable discussion was not going to work. These people were not interested in solving my water problem or working together as neighbors. They were interested in control, and they saw my well as a challenge to their authority. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I called the well contractor and told him to start drilling immediately. I had every legal right to dig a well on my property, and I was not going to let some power-hungry HOA board stop me from accessing the water I needed to make my ranch successful. I had no idea that this simple decision would lead to the most expensive and profitable conflict of my life. The well drilling took 3 days. I stood there every morning, watching the massive truck work its way deeper into the ground, feeling a mixture of excitement and defiance. The contractor was a weathered man named Pete who had been drilling wells in the area for over 20 years. "You got excellent water down there," he told me on the final day as clear, cold water began flowing from the new well. "This is some of the best water I have seen in years. You will never have to worry about supply again." I felt a surge of satisfaction as I watched the water flow. This was what independence looked like. This was what it meant to be truly self-sufficient. I had my own water source, fed by an underground river that had been flowing for thousands of years. No more depending on inadequate municipal supplies or bureaucratic delays. The celebration lasted exactly 4 days. On Monday morning, I found Linda Harrison standing on my front porch with a manila envelope in her hands. She was not alone this time. 2 other board members flanked her, along with a man in an expensive suit who looked like he had never been on a ranch in his life. "Mr. Johnson," Linda said, her voice carrying the same cold authority I remembered from the board meeting. "You have received multiple warnings about unauthorized well drilling on your property. Since you chose to ignore those warnings, we are left with no choice but to enforce the community covenants." She handed me the envelope with a smile that made my skin crawl. "This is your formal notice of violation and assessment of fines. You have 30 days to respond." I opened the envelope right there on the porch, expecting to find some reasonable fine that I could negotiate or pay off quickly. Instead, I found a document that made my knees weak and my vision blur. $250,000. The number was printed in bold black letters at the bottom of the first page, followed by a detailed breakdown of fines and penalties that read like a legal nightmare. Initial violation, $50,000. Daily accumulating penalties, $5,000 per day. Environmental impact fees, $75,000. Administrative costs, $20,000. Legal fees, $100,000. "This is insane," I whispered, my voice barely audible. $250,000 for digging a well on my own property. "The covenants are very clear about unauthorized modifications," Linda replied, her tone suggesting she was enjoying every second of my shock. "You were warned repeatedly, yet you chose to proceed anyway. Actions have consequences, Mr. Johnson." The man in the suit stepped forward, introducing himself as the HOA's attorney. "Mr. Johnson, I want to be clear about your situation. This fine is legally enforceable under the community covenants you agreed to when you purchased your property. You have 30 days to pay the full amount, or we will be forced to place a lien on your property and begin foreclosure proceedings." I stared at him, my mind racing through the financial implications. $250,000 was more money than I had ever seen in my life. It was more than I had paid for the entire ranch. It was more than I could earn in 5 years of working overtime. "You cannot be serious," I said, my voice growing stronger as the initial shock wore off. "I obtained every permit required by law. I followed every regulation. I have done nothing wrong." "You violated the HOA covenants," Linda replied simply. "That is all that matters here. You should have thought about the consequences before you decided to defy this board." After they left, I sat on my porch for hours, staring at the fine notice and trying to process what had just happened. The ranch I had dreamed of owning my entire life was about to be taken away from me because I had dared to dig a well for water. The savings I had accumulated over 25 years of hard work would not even cover half of this astronomical fine. I called 3 different lawyers that afternoon, hoping to find some way to fight this outrageous penalty. The conversations all followed the same pattern. Yes, the fine was excessive. Yes, it seemed unfair. But the HOA covenants were legally binding, and the board had broad authority to enforce them. "Your best bet is to negotiate," one lawyer told me. "Maybe they will accept a smaller amount or work out a payment plan. Fighting this in court would cost you more than the fine itself." But I could not let go of the nagging suspicion that something was not right about this whole situation. The fine was too large, too calculated, too precise. It was not designed to punish me for breaking rules. It was designed to destroy me financially and force me to sell my property. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of begging for mercy or trying to negotiate with people who had already shown their true colors, I was going to find out exactly what the Meadowbrook HOA was really after. I was going to follow the money. I spent the next 2 weeks becoming an expert on the Meadowbrook HOA. I requested every public record I could find, studied the subdivision's development history, and researched the background of every board member. What I discovered was a pattern of corruption that went far beyond simple power trips. The first red flag was the water contract. The Meadowbrook subdivision had an exclusive supply agreement with Clearwater Municipal Services, a private company that provided water to the entire area. The contract was worth over $2 million per year, with built-in rate increases that had been climbing steadily since the subdivision was built. But here is where it got interesting. When I dug deeper into the ownership structure of Clearwater Municipal Services, I found that 3 of the 5 HOA board members had financial stakes in the company. Linda Harrison's husband was a founding partner. The treasurer's brother was the operations manager. The secretary owned shares through a family trust. They were fining me for digging a well because my wealth threatened their water monopoly. The deeper I dug, the more obvious their scheme became. I found property records showing that 5 other ranch owners in the area had been hit with similar fines over the past 3 years. All of them had been forced to sell their properties at below-market prices. All of their land had been rezoned for residential development immediately after the sales. The HOA was not just collecting fines. They were systematically forcing property owners to sell so that the land could be developed into more homes that would require more water services from their private company. I found the smoking gun in the county planning office. A development proposal submitted just 6 months earlier showed plans for a 150-unit subdivision to be built on the exact area where my ranch was located. The proposal had been submitted by Meadowbrook Development, LLC, a company whose registered address was the same as Linda Harrison's home. They had been planning to take my land before I even knew I was under attack. But the most shocking discovery came when I researched the historical water rights for my property. The ranch had been in the same family for over 80 years before I bought it. The original water rights were filed in 1943, decades before the subdivision existed, giving my property priority access to the entire aquifer that supplied the area. According to the water rights documentation, my well was not just legal. It was the primary water source for the entire region, and every other user, including the subdivision, was technically secondary to my rights. I sat in my kitchen that night, surrounded by stacks of documents and legal papers, finally understanding the full scope of what I was facing. The HOA had not just tried to fine me for digging a well. They had tried to steal my property to expand their development empire, using fines and legal threats to force me out. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed I would be like the other property owners who had been intimidated into selling. They had assumed I would pay their extortion money or walk away from my dream. They had no idea that I was an engineer who specialized in water systems, with 25 years of experience in legal compliance and regulatory documentation. They had no idea that I would dig deep enough to uncover their entire operation. And most importantly, they had no idea that I now controlled the water rights that their entire scheme depended on. I spent the rest of the night researching water law and consulting with a specialized attorney who dealt with water rights disputes. The legal framework was complex, but the bottom line was simple. My property's water rights were senior to everyone else's, including the subdivision and the private water company. That meant I had the legal authority to cut off their water supply. The next morning, I called the well contractor and asked him to come back out to my property. Not to drill another well, but to install a valve system that would give me complete control over the water flow from my aquifer. "You want to be able to shut off the water to the whole area?" Pete asked, scratching his head. "That is a pretty unusual request." "I have unusual circumstances," I replied. "Can you do it?" "Sure, but it will cost you about $10,000 for the equipment and installation. You sure you want to spend that kind of money?" I looked at the $250,000 fine notice that was still sitting on my kitchen table. "Pete, that $10,000 is going to be the best investment I have ever made." 2 days later, I had a professional-grade valve system installed on my well, complete with remote monitoring and automatic shutoff capabilities. I also had something else, a business plan that was about to turn the HOA's attempt to destroy me into the most profitable venture of my life. If they wanted to play hardball with water rights, I was about to show them what a real water war looked like. The morning I cut off the water supply to the Meadowbrook subdivision was the most satisfying morning of my life. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, consulting with lawyers, reviewing water rights documentation, and making sure every action I took was completely legal and properly documented. I woke up at 6 a.m., made a pot of coffee, and walked out to the valve control system that Pete had installed near my well. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of perfect weather that made me remember why I had fallen in love with this ranch in the first place. I pulled out my phone and called the water rights attorney I had been working with. "Are you sure about this?" I asked him one more time. "I want to make absolutely certain that I am within my legal rights." "Mr. Johnson, you have senior water rights that predate every other user in the area by over 40 years, he replied patiently. "You have the absolute legal authority to control access to water from your aquifer. As long as you are willing to provide access at reasonable commercial rates, you are not only within your rights, you are operating a legitimate business." I hung up the phone and turned the valve. The effect was immediate. Within 2 hours, my phone started ringing. The first call was from a panicked resident of the subdivision, asking if I knew why their water pressure had dropped to nothing. The second call was from another resident, then another, then another. By noon, my phone was ringing continuously. I let most of the calls go to voicemail, but I answered the ones that sounded like they might be from Linda Harrison or other board members. I wanted to hear the panic in their voices. "Mr. Johnson, this is Linda Harrison from the Meadowbrook HOA. We are experiencing a water shortage in our community, and we have been told that you may have information about the cause." I smiled as I listened to her trying to sound professional and authoritative while clearly fighting back hysteria. "Hello, Linda. Yes, I can help you with that. I have exercised my senior water rights and taken control of the aquifer that supplies your subdivision. If you would like to discuss restoring water service, I would be happy to negotiate a commercial supply agreement." The silence on the other end of the line lasted for at least 30 seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaking with rage. "You cannot do this. This is illegal. We will have you arrested." "Actually, Linda, it is completely legal. I have consulted with water rights attorneys and confirmed that I have absolute authority over this water source. But I am a reasonable businessman. I would be happy to restore service once we reach a mutually acceptable agreement. I hung up the phone and spent the rest of the day fielding calls from desperate residents, angry board members, and confused municipal officials. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Initial outrage and threats, followed by bargaining, followed by resigned acceptance that I held all the cards. The best call came from Linda Harrison's husband, who turned out to be the founding partner of Clearwater Municipal Services. "Mr. Johnson, I think we can work something out. What would it take to restore normal water service to the subdivision?" "Well, let me think about that," I replied, pretending to consider his question. "You tried to fine me $250,000 for digging a well on my own property. You attempted to steal my land through fraudulent legal action. You have been systematically driving property owners out of the area to expand your development empire. I would say that changes the nature of our relationship significantly." "What do you want?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration. "I want the $250,000 fine withdrawn immediately. I want a written apology from the HOA board, and I want to establish a new water supply business that will provide fair and reasonable service to the entire community." "You are talking about extortion," he said. "No, I am talking about capitalism. You tried to monopolize the water supply for your own profit. I am simply offering competition. The difference is that my water rights are legally superior to yours, and my business model is going to be much more profitable." That afternoon, I officially registered Clearwater Ranch Water Services as a limited liability company. I had my lawyer draft commercial water supply contracts with pricing that was competitive but profitable. I ordered professional water testing to ensure quality standards. I even designed a logo and business cards. By the end of the week, I had signed contracts with 37 individual property owners who had chosen to bypass the HOA and deal directly with me for their water supply. The contracts were straightforward: reliable water service at reasonable rates, with no hidden fees or arbitrary rate increases. The HOA board tried to fight back, of course. They filed complaints with the county, threatened legal action, and even tried to organize a boycott of my water service. But none of it worked. My water rights were ironclad, my business was completely legitimate, and my customers were getting better service at lower prices than they had ever received from the HOA's monopoly. 3 weeks after I cut off the water supply, Linda Harrison called me with an offer to negotiate. The arrogance was gone from her voice, replaced by the defeated tone of someone who had finally realized they were beaten. "Mr. Johnson, the board is prepared to discuss terms for a long-term water supply agreement. We would like to schedule a meeting to work out the details." "I would be happy to meet with you, Linda, but I should mention that my rates have gone up since we last spoke. Supply and demand, you understand." The meeting with the HOA board was everything I had hoped it would be. They gathered in the same community center where they had dismissed my water concerns just a few months earlier, but this time the power dynamic was completely reversed. Instead of sitting in folding chairs like supplicants, they were the ones begging for my help. Linda Harrison looked like she had aged 10 years in the past month. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, her confident demeanor replaced by barely contained desperation. The other board members sat around the table like defeated generals, avoiding eye contact and speaking in hushed tones. "Mr. Johnson, we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. Linda began, her voice carefully measured. "We realize that the initial fine may have been excessive. We are prepared to withdraw all penalties and work out a reasonable agreement for water service." I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the moment. "Linda, I appreciate your willingness to negotiate, but I think you misunderstand the situation. I am not here to ask for your permission to operate my business. I am here to offer you the opportunity to become one of my customers." The water supply contracts I had prepared were generous but profitable. I was offering to provide unlimited water service to the entire subdivision for $500 per month per household, with a minimum 5-year commitment. The price was actually lower than what most residents had been paying to the HOA's private water company, but the volume meant I would be generating over $400,000 per year in revenue from the subdivision alone. "These rates are unreasonable," Linda protested, scanning the contract documents. "You are asking us to pay more than double what we were paying before." "Actually, you are incorrect about that," I replied, pulling out my research on their previous water costs. "According to the records I obtained, the average household in Meadowbrook was paying $650 per month for water service, with rate increases of 15% per year. My rate is not only lower, it is locked in for the entire term of the contract." The truth was even better than that. My costs for providing the water service were minimal. The well was already drilled, the infrastructure was already in place, and the water was essentially free. Every dollar I collected in service fees was pure profit. But the real money was not coming from the subdivision. Word of my water business had spread throughout the county, and I was receiving calls from property owners, developers, and even municipal governments who wanted to secure reliable water supplies for their projects. Within 6 months, I had signed contracts with 3 new residential developments, a commercial shopping center, and a small manufacturing facility. Each contract was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual revenue, and all of them were backed by the same senior water rights that had started this whole conflict. The most satisfying contract came from a development company that wanted to build a luxury subdivision about 10 miles from my ranch. They offered me a $2.3 million contract for exclusive water service to their 200-unit development, with a 20-year term and built-in rate increases tied to inflation. I signed that contract sitting at my kitchen table, using the same pen I had used to sign the $250,000 fine notice that had started this whole adventure. The irony was not lost on me. By the end of the first year, Clearwater Ranch Water Services had generated over $2.5 million in revenue. My operating costs were less than $200,000, which meant I was netting over $2.3 million in pure profit. The ranch that I had almost lost to HOA fines had become the foundation of a multi-million-dollar water empire. The best part was watching the HOA board members deal with the consequences of their own greed. Linda Harrison's husband lost his stake in the original water company when it went bankrupt, unable to compete with my superior water rights and lower prices. The board treasurer's brother was laid off when the company downsized. The secretary's family trust lost over $400,000 when their water company stock became worthless. I made sure to send each of them a personalized thank you note when my business reached the $2 million revenue mark. "Thank you for inspiring me to start my own water company," I wrote. "Your attempt to steal my property gave me the motivation to build something much bigger than I ever imagined." The final nail in the coffin came when the County Planning Commission rejected the HOA's proposal to rezone my ranch for residential development. The application was denied because of concerns about water supply, since I now controlled the only reliable water source in the area. Without the ability to guarantee water service to new developments, their entire land grab scheme collapsed. The HOA was left with a bunch of overpriced subdivision lots and no way to expand their empire. I was left with a thriving business, a beautiful ranch, and the satisfaction of knowing that I had turned their attack on my property into the most profitable venture of my life. The $250,000 fine that was supposed to destroy me had become the catalyst for a $2.5 million success story. Sometimes the best revenge is not just getting even. Sometimes the best revenge is getting rich. 2 years after this whole ordeal began, I was sitting on my front porch, watching the sunrise over my ranch and thinking about how much my life had changed. The water crisis that had nearly destroyed me had become the foundation of a business empire that generated more money than I had ever dreamed of earning. Clearwater Ranch Water Services now employed 12 full-time workers and served over 3,000 customers across 3 counties. We had expanded beyond basic water service to include water quality testing, well drilling, and irrigation system design. The company was valued at over $8 million, and I was receiving offers from investors who wanted to help me expand into other states. The ranch itself had become everything I had originally hoped for and more. The abundant water supply from my well had allowed me to develop a thriving organic farming operation that supplied vegetables to restaurants throughout the region. I had built a state-of-the-art barn, installed solar panels to power the entire property, and even added a guest house for the family and friends who visited regularly. But the most satisfying part of this story is what happened to the people who tried to destroy me. The Meadowbrook HOA had been dissolved after a series of lawsuits revealed the extent of their corruption. Linda Harrison and her husband had been forced to sell their home and move out of the area after losing over $600,000 in legal fees and failed business ventures. The other board members had faced similar consequences. The treasurer had filed for bankruptcy. The secretary had lost her family's trust fund to bad investments. The development company they had all been involved with had collapsed when their water supply contracts were terminated. I took no pleasure in their personal suffering, but I felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that justice had been served. They had tried to use their positions of authority to steal from me, and the system had ultimately held them accountable for their actions. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that bullies only have power when their victims are willing to be intimidated. The HOA board had used the same tactics on other property owners who had chosen to pay their extortion money rather than fight back. They had counted on me being just another victim who would write a check and walk away. But I had done something different. I had taken the time to understand the law, research their motivations, and find their weaknesses. I had turned their own greed against them and used their attack on my property as the foundation for building something much bigger than they could ever destroy. Today, I provide water service to most of the same people who had supported the HOA's attempt to find me out of existence. The difference is that I provide better service at lower prices, with transparent pricing and no hidden fees. I have proven that honest competition is always better than corrupt monopolies. My advice to anyone facing a similar situation is simple. Do not let bullies win through intimidation. Research your rights, understand the law, and look for ways to turn their attacks into opportunities. Sometimes the best defense is not just a good offense, but a profitable offense. The ranch I almost lost to a $250,000 fine is now the headquarters of a multi-million-dollar business that provides essential services to thousands of customers. The well that started this whole conflict now supplies water to half the county. And every morning when I wake up on my own land, drinking water from my own well, I remember that the most satisfying revenge is not just getting even. It is building something better than what your enemies tried to take away from you.